The silence between them spoke louder than any words. The room was quiet except for the soft tapping of rain against the window pane. It was the kind of silence that made every thought louder. Sandra Bullock sat alone on the couch in her softly lit Lowe's Angels home, wrapped in a gray cardigan, her fingers loosely clasped around a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the city buzzed like always, but inside it was still. Still in a way that felt like the world had paused. She had been thinking about him again. Keanu Reeves. Not the movie star Keanu, not the red carpet Keanu, but the man, the friend. The one who knew how to sit in silence without making it awkward. The one who once brought her a cupcake on a bad day, no cameras, no audience, just Keanu being Keanu. They hadn't spoken in a while, not like they used to. Life had a funny way of making space where connection once lived. Careers exploded, families shifted, people changed. Or maybe they just got too afraid to say what needed to be said, because the truth, the real truth, it was hidden in glances and unspoken what-ifs. It had always been that way between them. It had started years ago, a movie set, Speed. They had been young, full of fire and possibility. Everyone said their chemistry lit up the screen, but what happened off-screen was quieter, sweeter, like a language only they spoke. They would laugh for hours about the dumbest things, late-night coffee runs, singing badly in trailers, daring each other to do outrageous things in between takes. And yet underneath the laughter there had always been a tension. A tender tension. One that felt like a door left slightly open, waiting to be walked through. But neither of them had. And now here she was, years later, alone, staring at a photograph of the two of them from decades ago, her thumb slowly brushing over the image. She didn't know why that night felt heavier than others. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe, just maybe, it was the voicemail he'd left that morning. "Hey Sandy, call me when you can. I've been thinking about something important." His voice hadn't changed, still calm, still thoughtful, but there had been something different about his tone. A weight, a pause, like he had finally decided on something after years of wrestling with it. She hadn't called back, not yet. She didn't know why, or maybe she did. Because if she called, what if everything changed? Across town, Keanu Reeves stood in his kitchen, nervously drumming his fingers against the marble countertop. The phone sat face up next to him, the screen dark, still no return call. He glanced at the clock. It had been 9 hours. He wasn't used to this kind of nervousness. He could walk onto a set and deliver pages of dialogue without flinching. He could ride motorcycles through chaos in a movie and barely blink. But this was different. This was Sandra, the only woman who'd ever made him feel seen, truly seen. Not for the fame, not for the tragedy of his past, not for his name, but for the man he was in the quiet moments. She saw through the armor. She always had. He remembered the moment he knew he had fallen for her. It wasn't during the filming of Speed. It wasn't even when they reunited years later for the lake house. It was a random Tuesday afternoon. They were sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons, a rare off day. She was telling him a story about her mom, laughing with tears in her eyes, and he just watched her. Noticed the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the way her voice softened when she talked about love. And in that moment he had thought, if I ever get married, it'd be to someone like her. But he never said it, and time went on. Life went on. Other people came and went, but Sandra had remained constant, quietly, like a lighthouse in the fog. And now, all these years later, he was ready to tell her, ready to ask her something he should have asked a long time ago. But she hadn't called back. Meanwhile, Sandra stood by her window, phone in hand. Her thumb hovered over the call-back button. Her heart was pounding. She didn't even know what she was afraid of. Maybe that it was too late, or maybe that it was. And then the phone lit up. Keanu Reeves. She froze. Should she pick it up? Should she let it ring? But something in her soul whispered, answer. She did. "Hey," she said softly. "Sandy," he replied, voice just above a whisper. "Thanks for picking up." There was a pause, long, waited. "I've been thinking," he said, "about us, about everything." She swallowed hard. "Me too." He exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath for years. "I don't want to wonder anymore. I don't want to pretend. I don't want to die without telling you the truth." Her breath caught. "I love you, Sandra, and I don't want to wait another day to say it. I want to marry you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Because sometimes the longest journeys are not across oceans or countries, but across the heart. And after years of laughter, loss, life, and longing, his truth had finally arrived. And now hers had to rise to meet it. Her answer came with tears, not words. The rain hadn't stopped. It beat softly against the window as if the sky itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. In Sandra's living room, the world felt suspended in time. Her fingers trembled as she held the phone to her ear, heart echoing louder than the storm outside. Keanu's words still lingered in the air like a match that had just been struck in a dark room, raw, real, and too sudden to be ignored. He had said it, the words no one ever imagined would come from his quiet, gentle soul. "I want to marry you." Not as a friend, not as a co-star. As a man who had waited too long to admit his heart had never stopped choosing her. And she couldn't speak. It wasn't because she didn't feel the same. Oh, she did, more than he would ever know. But it was because that moment, those seconds following his confession, felt like everything they had avoided suddenly collapsing into one instant. And in that collapsing, there was so much to mourn. The years they had wasted pretending they were fine just being friends. The dinners they could have shared, the holidays they spent apart. The comfort they might have had in each other's arms, while pretending to the world they weren't aching in silence. Her silence wasn't rejection. It was grief over time lost and chances never taken. And Keanu, he knew. He could feel it in her pause. This wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of someone whose heart had been waiting for too long. He didn't rush her. He never did. Instead, he just stayed on the line, letting her breathe, letting her feel, because love, real love, doesn't demand. It waits. Sandra closed her eyes and sank onto the couch, phone still pressed to her ear. She took a breath, a deep one that reached back into all the days she had pushed her feelings down. And then tears fell, not of sadness, but of release, of recognition, of knowing that after years of dancing around each other, the music had finally stopped, and it was time to face the truth that had always been between them. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," he said gently, "so am I." She laughed through the tears, that same old laugh he used to tease her about, the one that sounded like the beginning of something, and somehow in that tiny sound, everything cracked open. "I've thought about this," she confessed, voice barely holding itself together. "More times than I want to admit, but I never believed you'd ever feel the same. I thought maybe I was just a chapter in your story, not the story itself." He inhaled slowly, as if breathing in her vulnerability. "You were never a chapter, Sandra. You were the spine." That did it. The tears came faster, not because he was poetic, but because he meant it. Because no one had ever said something so clear, so unmistakably true to her. Not in the years of fame, not in the noise of Hollywood. Only him, Keanu, could speak like that. Quiet, certain, soulful. "I don't know if I know how to do this," she murmured. "To love someone in the open, not with secrets, not with fear." "You already do," he replied. "You've loved me in silence all these years. That's harder than anything." There was a long pause. Then, without warning, she spoke a single sentence, one that didn't say yes, but said everything else. "Can you come over?" He didn't need a map. He didn't ask if she was sure. He just said, "I'm on my way," and hung up. Keanu drove through the rain like a man chasing not a person, but destiny. His fingers clenched the steering wheel, but his heart was open, beating louder with every streetlight he passed. The roads glistened in the night, reflections of city lights dancing on the wet pavement, as if Los Angeles itself was shimmering in anticipation. He had never felt like this before, not even on the biggest days of his life. No red carpet, no movie premiere, no fanfare. Just the sound of the road beneath him, the windshield wipers keeping time with the rhythm of a heart that had waited too long. When he pulled up to her house, he didn't even bother with an umbrella. He let the rain fall on him like baptism, washing away years of hesitation. His boots hit the pavement, soaked in seconds, but he walked forward with purpose, with love. Sandra opened the door before he knocked. She stood there barefoot, in that same cardigan, eyes swollen with emotion, yet more beautiful than ever, not because of makeup, not because of lighting, but because she was finally unguarded. And for the first time, he saw the woman behind the star, behind the wit and the laughter, the woman who had waited too long to be chosen. They didn't speak at first. They just stood there, two people soaking wet in a threshold that felt like the edge of everything they had ever known. And then she did something unexpected, something utterly human. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, tight, wordless, sobbing. Keanu didn't hesitate. He held her like a man who had come home after years lost at sea. His hands were gentle on her back, his cheek resting on her hair as she wept into his shoulder. No kiss, no grand gesture, just two hearts breaking open at the same time. And in that embrace, everything changed. It wasn't about marriage, not yet. It wasn't about rings or dresses or announcements. It was about belonging, about finally allowing themselves to admit that love had always been there, quietly surviving under layers of denial. When she finally pulled back, her eyes searched his, not for answers, but for courage. And he gave it, not with words, but with the way he gently tucked her hair behind her ear like he had always wanted to. The way his gaze didn't waver. The way he held her face like it was something sacred. "You're freezing," she whispered, brushing his soaked shirt. "Then warm me up," he smiled faintly, and she laughed that same beautiful laugh again, this time brighter. She pulled him inside and shut the door. The rain kept falling, but inside they were finally dry. And the rest of the night, it wouldn't be shared with the world. It would belong only to them, a night of conversation, of healing, of rediscovering the magic that never left, of facing what had always been waiting in the wings, a love so patient it had waited decades. The night that changed everything. The morning light crept in through the linen curtains like a secret, soft and golden, casting a delicate glow across the room. The world outside had stilled after the night's rain, the city no longer roaring but breathing, as if nature itself knew something had shifted inside that quiet house. Keanu stirred before Sandra did, his eyes opening slowly to find her curled beside him on the couch, her head resting against his chest, her breath calm and steady. The TV still glowed dimly in the background, the credits of an old black-and-white movie having long finished playing. But the real story, the one that mattered, was unfolding in that very room, not on a screen, but in the silence between two people who had finally let their hearts speak. He didn't move, not because he was afraid to wake her, but because he didn't want the moment to end. There was something sacred about holding her like this, no costumes, no scripts, no distance, just warmth, skin to skin, heart to heart. Her fingers were lightly wrapped around the edge of his shirt, like she didn't want him to leave even in sleep. It wasn't about lust. It wasn't even about comfort. It was about finally feeling at peace. For years, he had gone through the motions of a life well lived, success, travel, solitude, charity, but none of it ever filled the space that only she seemed to occupy. And now, here she was, not as a fantasy, not as a memory, but real and present and fragile in his arms. Sandra slowly began to stir, her eyes blinking open, and when they locked with his, there was no awkwardness, just quiet understanding. She didn't speak right away. She simply watched him, searching his face like someone who had finally come home after being lost in the dark. And then she smiled, a sleepy, vulnerable, utterly unguarded smile that made his heart ache in the best way. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice still laced with sleep. "Of course I did," he replied softly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I always would have if you'd let me." She sat up slowly, pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she looked out the window. The rain had stopped, but the street was still wet, glistening like glass under the rising sun. "Do you think it's too late?" she asked, barely audible. "For us?" Keanu followed her gaze for a long moment before answering. "No," he said simply. "I think the only thing that would make it too late is if we keep pretending we don't need each other." Her eyes welled with tears again, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she reached for his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. It felt natural, easy, like slipping into a favorite song after years of static. "I'm scared," she admitted again, but this time there was a smile with it, as if the fear itself was becoming less powerful the more she spoke it out loud. "Me too," he said with a chuckle, "but maybe that's what makes it real." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light grow stronger until the city outside began to wake up. But in that room, time moved differently. They talked about everything, not the movies or the fame, but the in-between moments no one ever asked them about. The times they thought about each other but didn't call. The dreams they had but never pursued. The people they dated trying to fill the gap they didn't even know had a name. "I used to sit in the back of premieres," Sandra said quietly, "and wish you were beside me. But I never said anything because I didn't want to ruin the friendship." Keanu's voice was low, rich with emotion. "And I used to wonder what it would feel like to reach for your hand in public, not as a co-star, but as someone who had the right to." She looked at him then, eyes shimmering. "Do you think we can start now? Not try to rewrite the past, just write something new?" He nodded slowly, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I don't want perfect, I just want honest with you." And so they began, not with a proposal, not with a public announcement, but with a decision. A decision to show up, to be vulnerable, to stop hiding behind humor and distance and years of pretending. They made breakfast together that morning like a couple who had been doing it for years, messy eggs, burnt toast, laughter spilling over coffee cups. And it was perfect in its imperfection. Later that day, they went for a walk. No disguises, no hiding, just two people walking side by side through a city that had known them as stars but had never known their story. The paparazzi didn't matter, the headlines didn't matter. What mattered was the way their hands remained linked, even when no one was watching. At one point, Sandra paused in front of a small bookstore on a quiet corner, the same one where they once did a surprise meet and greet for a film. She smiled softly. "Remember this place?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, you bought me that book of poetry, said it reminded you of me." "It still does," she whispered. He turned to her, serious now. "You know what I remember most about that day?" She raised a curious brow. "I remember wishing I had kissed you, right here on this street in front of everyone." She laughed, a bit breathless. "Why didn't you?" He took a step closer, the space between them narrowing to nothing. "Because I thought you deserved someone braver." And then in the middle of that sidewalk, in the heart of a city that never sleeps, he kissed her finally. And it wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, sure, and slow. Like two souls recognizing one another again after lifetimes apart. Like a promise written not in words, but in presence. When they pulled away, Sandra didn't speak. She just leaned her forehead against his and closed her eyes, the tears silent but grateful. Because finally, after all the years, all the pain, all the hiding, she was no longer waiting. She was living. Love wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the hardest part. The days that followed felt like a quiet dream, not the loud, overwhelming kind that storms into your life demanding attention, but the kind that settles gently into your bones and reminds you what peace feels like. Sandra and Keanu found themselves falling into an unfamiliar rhythm, one without cameras, without scripts, without the armor of professionalism they had used for decades to protect themselves from the world. Their love was no longer something distant and poetic. It was real, messy, raw, and it was finally breathing in the open air. They didn't rush, they didn't pretend to be a fairy tale. Instead, they existed in small moments, grocery store runs where she teased him about his obsession with avocados, lazy afternoons where he read to her from the same poetry book she once gave him, and quiet evenings curled up on the couch where no one had to perform or impress. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't headline-worthy, but it was sacred, and it was enough. But love, real love, has its shadows too. One morning, as Keanu stood at the stove flipping pancakes, the kind Sandra liked with blueberries in the middle, he noticed she had gone unusually quiet. She was sitting at the dining table, her gaze fixed on a photograph that had been lying underneath some unopened mail. It was an old picture, one she hadn't seen in years, her and her mother, arms wrapped around each other during a film festival in the early days of her career. The smile on her mother's face was proud, almost radiant. And for a moment, Sandra didn't see herself as she was now, seasoned, strong, successful. She saw herself as a daughter again, a daughter who never got to ask the questions she was finally ready to ask. Keanu turned off the stove, plated the pancakes with quiet care, and walked over. He placed the plate in front of her but said nothing. He knew. He always knew when words were useless, when silence was the language required. "I never introduced her to anyone," Sandra said softly, running her finger along the edge of the photo. "Not really. She met co-stars, colleagues, acquaintances, but never someone I loved, because I never let myself love anyone long enough, never trusted anyone to stay." Keanu sat down beside her, not touching her yet, but near enough to make her feel held. "She would have liked me?" he asked with a hint of warmth. Sandra laughed through the ache. "She would have adored you. You're kind, you listen, you don't try to fix pain, you just sit with it. She always said that's what real men do." He looked at her, his eyes deep with something ancient and patient. "Then I hope, wherever she is, she sees that I stayed." That one sentence unraveled her completely, because that had always been her fear, that no one would. That love in her world was fleeting, something used for promotion, photos, red carpets, something that came with conditions. But Keanu had rewritten that for her, not with grand speeches, but by showing up again and again when no one else had. Later that night, she sat beside him in the garden, a glass of wine in her hand, her feet bare against the grass, and the stars glowing softly above like quiet witnesses. The Hollywood hills shimmered in the distance, but it all felt so far away now, the pressure, the noise, the expectations. Out here in the stillness of the dark, there were only two people, finally brave enough to face their truth. "I want to try," she said quietly, staring up at the sky. "I don't know how to be someone's partner without overthinking it, without expecting it to end, but I want to try with you." Keanu looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Then we'll try together, one day at a time." But even in that moment of promise, life, unpredictable, ruthless, unscripted life, began to stir its own conflict. The very next morning, Keanu received a call from Tokyo. A long-standing project he had quietly committed to years ago, a private charity initiative focused on helping children of domestic violence survivors, was facing a crisis. The main sponsor had pulled out and the local team was struggling. He had been the face of the program, the one whose silent donations had kept it running under the radar. Now they needed him not just as a donor, but as a presence, a leader, a voice. He held the phone for a long while after the call ended, his thumb grazing the side, his mind running through 100 thoughts. How could he leave now? Just when something real was finally taking root. Just when Sandra had opened the door to a future neither of them thought possible. But how could he not go, knowing people were depending on him in the way only he could deliver? When he told Sandra later that afternoon, she didn't flinch. She didn't accuse or plead or fall into silence. She just listened, nodded, and then did something that stunned him. She smiled. "You should go," she said softly, her hand finding his. "Because if you didn't, you wouldn't be the man I fell in love with." He tried to hide the way his throat tightened. "It could be a month, maybe more. I'll be on planes and meetings, running back and forth. It won't be easy to stay connected." "We've spent decades not calling each other when we should have," she replied with a quiet strength. "This time we will." And so they made no promises of fairy tales. Only reality, only commitment, only truth. When he left for the airport that evening, Sandra stood at the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest, not because she was cold, but because she was holding in 100 emotions she didn't know how to say. Keanu leaned forward, kissed her forehead, and whispered something that would stay with her every single day until he returned. "I'm not walking away, I'm walking forward toward us." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind an echo of love that didn't vanish with distance, but grew stronger with it. The space between us was meant to be crossed. The silence that followed his departure wasn't empty, it was alive. A living, breathing ache that filled every corner of Sandra's home with memory. The seat at the edge of the bed still held the faint warmth of his body. The mug he had used for coffee was still resting in the sink, the tiniest lipstick smudge on the rim from a playful moment they shared that morning. She caught herself brushing her fingers across the surface of the furniture, as if trying to preserve the echo of his presence, the quiet steadiness that had somehow steadied her too. It wasn't that she needed him to function. She had built her own empire, shaped her own world. But his absence now carved into her like proof of just how deeply he'd become a part of her rhythm without either of them noticing. The first few days were filled with messages, sweet voice notes, photos from the airports, a blurry selfie of him on the Bullock train in Japan squinting into the sun. He was still Keanu, grounded, observant, humble. Even in another country, he never let go of the thread they had built, and neither did she. They would FaceTime late at night, laughing over dropped calls and poor Wi-Fi, sharing meals from thousands of miles apart. And yet, even with the calls and texts, there was a loneliness that curled into Sandra's chest at night, a silence no technology could cure. It wasn't just about missing his touch. It was about the vulnerability of opening your heart and watching the one you love walk into a world of unpredictability. There were always risks, not dramatic ones like in the movies they once starred in, but real ones, long hours, physical exhaustion, the public microscope. Being apart reminded her of why she had always kept herself closed off in the first place. Because this kind of love, the real kind, wasn't painless. It asked you to trust the unknown. It asked you to believe in what you could not control. And one night, everything nearly fell apart. She was at a charity event, the kind of social obligation she had once mastered like a second skin. The cameras flashed, the drinks flowed, and the questions came. But this time, they weren't about her next film or foundation. They were about him, about them. Rumors had started spinning like whispers in a storm. A photo of Keanu speaking with a beautiful woman at a Tokyo press gathering. A blog post speculating whether he had moved on during his time away, and the classic headline that always appeared when two stars dared to love each other in private. Was it just another Hollywood fling? She smiled through it, politely declined to comment, laughed at the tabloids. But when she got home that night and shut the door behind her, she collapsed into the silence like it was an old enemy. Her fingers shook as she opened her phone, scrolling through social media, knowing better but doing it anyway. And there it was, a 10-second clip of Keanu smiling with a young Japanese actress during a press conference. Nothing inappropriate, nothing scandalous. But the comments tore through her like needles, strangers dissecting a love they couldn't see, assuming betrayal where there was none. Her insecurities came roaring to the surface like old ghosts awakened. Was I foolish to believe this was different? Was I just another phase in his life? Did I imagine all of it? She didn't call him, not that night. Instead, she walked through the house like a woman haunted not by a person but by her own fear. That she had opened the door too wide. That maybe love for someone like her was meant to be just out of reach. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Keanu sat in a small Tokyo apartment, barefoot on a woven mat, staring at his phone that hadn't buzzed all evening. He could feel the distance widening, not physically but emotionally. He had seen the clip too, had watched as his kindness to a fellow actress became twisted by a world obsessed with scandal. And he hated it, not because of the headlines, but because he knew what it could do to someone like Sandra, someone who had been burned before. Someone who didn't need another reason to retreat into silence. And so he did what he always did. He showed up with honesty. The next morning, Sandra found a delivery at her doorstep. Not flowers, not a diamond, but something deeply, devastatingly simple. A hardcover book wrapped in linen cloth with a handwritten note on top. This is the first book I ever read that made me believe in love again. I've been carrying it for years, but it always felt like I didn't have the right person to share it with. Until you. I know the world spins stories louder than we can silence. But if you believe in us, even when we're not in the same time zone, I promise I'll never let that belief go to waste. Okay. Tears spilled freely then, not because of the gesture, but because of the grace. He didn't argue with the rumors. He didn't defend himself with anger or call her to demand trust. He gave her something sacred, his vulnerability, his quiet consistency, and it pierced through her doubt like light through fog. She called him seconds later. No pleasantries, no build-up. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't owe me that," he replied softly. "But I needed to say it," she insisted. "Because I let fear speak louder than love for a moment, and I promised myself I wouldn't do that again, not with you." There was a pause, and she could hear him exhale, that same warm exhale that always calmed her. "I'm flying back," he said. She froze, "But your project." "They'll be fine," he interrupted. "I've spent years saving things that didn't need me as much as you do right now. This time I choose us." When he walked back through her front door 3 days later, he didn't bring suitcases or an entourage. Just a small backpack slung over his shoulder and that same unreadable calm in his eyes. And as soon as she saw him, not the actor, not the icon, but him, she rushed into his arms like the world had stopped spinning and finally remembered where home was. That night they sat in the garden again beneath a sky that was still learning how to hold stars. No music, no speeches, just silence. And then out of nowhere, Keanu pulled something from his jacket. Not a ring, not yet, but a folded page from the book he had given her. On it he had written 5 words. "When you're ready, I am." She looked up at him, her heart full and trembling. "I'm close," she whispered, "so close." And he smiled. Because love wasn't about pressure. It was about patience. When love finally spoke its name. The world didn't change the day she said yes, not in the explosive way movies often promise. There were no fireworks, no orchestras playing in the background, no rain falling dramatically just in time for the kiss. Instead, the world changed in the most human of ways, gently, almost unnoticeably, like a breeze slipping through an open window. And perhaps that was the most honest kind of change. The kind that didn't announce itself, but simply arrived and stayed. Sandra stood in the doorway of her sunlit kitchen, barefoot, holding a cup of tea with both hands, her eyes fixed on the garden outside where Keanu was kneeling in the soil, planting something with care. He'd become obsessed with the idea of growing lavender, said he wanted the house to smell like peace. And she had laughed, but secretly loved the thought. Watching him now, grounded, quiet content made something ache and bloom inside her all at once. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about trust. About the choice to keep showing up, not because everything was perfect, but because they were no longer afraid to be imperfect together. It had been 2 months since he returned from Tokyo, 2 months of slow healing, soft mornings, and long, unfinished conversations. They had learned how to argue, how to apologize, how to sit in silence without fear. And in all that time, the question he had once whispered, "I want to marry you," had never been forced again. It simply hung in the air, suspended like a promise that didn't need pressure to survive. And maybe that's why when the moment finally came, it didn't feel like a climax. It felt like breathing. That night she found him at the piano. He didn't play often, only when something was too big to say. His fingers moved over the keys slowly, the melody soft and searching, and she stood in the doorway listening not just to the music, but to the man. To the story he was telling without words. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a woman waiting to be chosen. She felt like a woman who had chosen herself, and who was now ready to choose him fully, not in secrecy, not in fear, but with the clarity of someone who had known loss and chosen love anyway. She walked over and sat beside him on the piano bench. He didn't stop playing, didn't even look at her. But he shifted his weight, leaning just enough for their shoulders to touch. That was how he always let her know he was listening. "I used to think," she began, voice quiet, "that love was something you had to earn, that you had to be ready for it, fixed, perfect, whole." His fingers slowed, then stilled, but he didn't interrupt. "But I'm starting to believe something else now," she continued. "That maybe love is what makes you ready. Maybe love is the thing that finds you in your unfinished places and stays long enough to help you grow." She turned to him, and this time he met her gaze, his expression open, patient, aching just a little. "I don't need a perfect ending," she whispered. "I just want a beginning with you, if you'll still have me." He didn't speak, not with words. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a small, worn velvet pouch, the kind that didn't sparkle but meant something. He opened it slowly, revealing a ring that was simple, understated, a single, vintage diamond surrounded by tiny imperfections in the band. He didn't offer it like a proposal. He placed it in her hand like a truth. "This belonged to my mother," he finally said, voice thick. "She told me once, when you find someone who sees your shadows and doesn't flinch, you don't wait. You give them something that already has love in it." Sandra stared down at the ring for a long moment, and her tears came not from surprise but from relief, because it wasn't about the ring. It was about the timing, about how, for once in her life, someone had waited long enough for her heart to catch up to her soul. She didn't say yes, she didn't need to. She slid the ring onto her finger, took his hand in hers, and leaned her head against his shoulder. And in that quiet, shared stillness, everything became new again. They didn't announce their engagement to the world. There was no press release, no photo shoot, no staged Instagram post. Instead, they lived it. They let their love speak in the ways it had always wanted to, not in performances, but in presence. Keanu went back to his motorcycle shop part-time, restoring old bikes with the same care he gave his relationships. Sandra began producing small indie films again, mentoring young female directors with a fierce maternal spirit. They took walks without disguises, smiled for fans without hiding, held hands in bookstores and kissed at red lights. And the world, for once, respected the sacredness of something they didn't pretend to understand. On a quiet afternoon 6 months later, they stood beneath a crooked tree in Santa Ynez, barefoot on the soil, surrounded by only 15 people. No gowns, no tuxedos, just light linen clothes and the smell of lavender wafting from the garden they had grown together. She didn't walk down an aisle, she walked straight toward him. He didn't cry when she reached him. He cried when she said 3 words that meant everything. "I'm not afraid." And he whispered back, "Then we begin." They exchanged vows they wrote in secret journals, and rings made from melted down pieces of old jewelry they no longer wore, symbols not of wealth, but of transformation. Every scar, every silence, every missed moment that once kept them apart now lived in the gold wrapped around their fingers, not as regrets, but as reminders. Their first dance wasn't to music. It was to the sound of their friends clapping and laughing as they twirled barefoot on the grass, the sun setting gently behind them like a curtain closing on Act 1 and opening on something new, something earned. And as the sky turned orange and the lanterns began to flicker above, Sandra leaned into Keanu's chest and whispered something that made him still. "All this time," she said, "I thought the world would break me if I loved too much, but you made me braver." He held her tighter, pressing his lips to her hair, and replied with words he had waited a lifetime to say. "You didn't need saving. You just needed someone who wouldn't let go. And he never did. Not then. Not ever.